Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good to be back and studying some headlines. A couple of items been catching my attention lately. This one just very timely, as was part of a conversation even yesterday, as we are now currently following daylight savings time, which means more daylight and something that can sometimes be confusing, depending if you're trying to call someone overseas. But recently, there was a bill passed in the Senate, which seems to be heading in the way of making daylight savings time permanent. So no more of this fall back, spring forward mishigas in terms of having to keep track of things. You may recall a couple of years ago, the daylight savings time period was extended, and we started moving back later in the calendar in November. We started springing forward earlier in March. This is something that they seem to try and increase the amount of daylight savings time. And in fact, we were just talking yesterday, I was talking this morning with someone that in Israel, it used to be that they would move the clocks back before Yom Kippur and move them forward after Pesach. The idea they wanted they would want Yom Kippur to end earlier, and they wanted the Pesach Seder to start earlier. They wanted to, cover the best of everything, right? Even though Yom Kippur is always going to be 25 hours, it feels different if you're ending the fast at 6 o'clock instead of ending it at 7:30. So it would always be that way. It happened to come along with a kind of a tricky slichos start time. So I think part of the move was to accommodate that. As we'll see, there could be certain challenges to various rituals that emerge, and it also may help us appreciate some of the some of the time-related issues that we face as Jews, especially with the Seder coming up in just a couple of weeks. We're going to encounter one of the most common questions is that rabbis get, especially from families with younger children, is how early can the Seder start? You don't really have to have a family with children. Why should the Seder start so late and end so late? And so none of these issues are connected. But let's start by looking at the headline. All right, this comes from last week. U.S. Senate approves bill to make daylight savings time permanent. U.S. Senate on Tuesday passed legislation that would make daylight savings time permanent starting in 2023, ending the twice annual changing of clocks in a move promoted by supporters advocating brighter afternoons and more economic activity. Right? People often go out as long as there's daylight, so that means more going out. The Senate approved the measure called the Sunshine Protection Act unanimously by voice vote. House of Representatives, which has held a committee hearing on the matter, must still pass the bill before it can go to President Joe Biden to sign. Senator Marco Rubio, one of the bill's sponsors, said supporters agreed the change would not take place until November 2023. After input from airlines and broadcasters, the change would help enable children to play outdoors later and reduce seasonal depression, according to supporters. The idea that when it gets darker earlier, it darkens our mood. National Association of Convenience Stores opposes the changes, telling Congress this month we should not have little kids going to school in the dark, referencing the fact that in some parts of the country, sunrise will be after 9 a.m., right? So basically imagine right now the sun rising. Some of us have been up for 2-3 hours. That's a lot of moving around in the dark. So that's the report. Now this came essentially out of nowhere. Didn't come out of nowhere. This has been discussed for a while. In particular, Florida has been this issue. Certain states, I believe Alaska and Hawaii, no. Arizona does not have daylight savings time. So there are certain states that don't have it, and Florida was one of the states that was toying with this elimination of any changing of the clocks to begin with. And so this has been discussed, and it came up actually almost 50 years ago, back in the 70s, at the height of the energy crisis, and when there was a boycott at the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, and there were gasoline lines, and the thinking was you have more light, you burn less fuel. consume less energy. So it came up then and was analyzed from a Jewish law perspective. But Orthodox group got wind of this, and this is from the forward yesterday. Orthodox groups launch uphill battle against daylight saving time bill. Orthodox advocacy groups are launching a long shot bid to stall a bipartisan bill that would make daylight savings time permanent across the nation. In a letter expected to be sent to congressional leaders on Monday, an advance copy obtained by the Forward, the Orthodox Union warned that the bill, which was passed by the Senate last week by unanimous consent, will interfere with the ability of members of our community to engage in congregational prayers and get to their places of work on time. Jewish law requires that daily morning prayers be recited after sunrise. Making daylight savings time permanent will mean later sunrises and later sunsets. The starkest example of this would occur in the winter when sunrise in some cities across the country will be after 9 a.m. Senator Marco Rubio, a Republican from Florida, one of the authors of Sunshine Protection Act, first introduced in 2018, maintained that permanent daylight savings time will help prevent pedestrian accidents, reduce crime, and decrease seasonal depression and childhood obesity. Rabbi Abba Cohn, Vice President for Government Affairs at the Umbrella Orthodox Group Agudath Israel of America, said in an interview that leaders were caught by surprise with the swift passage of the bill, despite communicating their views with the office of Rubio when it was reintroduced last year. There was no advance knowledge or forewarning that this was coming, he said. Cohn added that he was equally surprised it passed by unanimous consent, which is rare under any circumstances, especially in a 50-50 divided Senate. So we see here the reaction in the Orthodox community is negative. OU, Agudath Israel, concerned about minyan times. Now, we will have to, on the halachic issue, we'll have to dig a little bit more deeply, because it says here in the article that you have to wait until sunrise for morning services, and that's not factually correct. It is possible to daven earlier than that, and we'll look at the specifics. But this is, the concern is that it will wreak havoc with minyan and how the morning takes place, and then to some extent the afternoon. Is this a good enough reason to oppose a law? Maybe, maybe not. But these organizations are concerned with the needs of their constituents, and like any advocacy organization, they're there to speak up for their constituents. Now, this idea of being caught by surprise is, and the fact that it passed by unanimous consent in a evenly divided Senate, is an interesting note, which was picked up by some news outlets. And this article is source number 3 from BuzzFeed. Everyone was surprised by the Senate passing permanent daylight savings time, especially the senators. Reporters and politicals were caught off guard Tuesday afternoon when the Sunshine Protection Act sailed through the Senate without issue, with no senators speaking up to object to it passing by unanimous consent. Senator Kristen Sinema, serving as the Senate chair overseeing the motion at the time, broke composure, burst into a grin, and whispered, "Yes. I was surprised that someone didn't object," she told BuzzFeed News the next day, while noting Arizona does not change the clocks because we're smart. Okay, let's go hear it for Arizona. Any single senator could have blocked the daylight saving bill from passing, but many didn't know it was even happening. Senator Rick Scott, a permanent daylight saving time proponent who signed a similar bill into law when he was governor of Florida, said he would have gone to give a speech on the Senate floor if he had known. Asked to recreate his reaction to the new Senator, Chris Coons issued a brief series of shocked stammers that is impossible to phonetically translate, something like going, ah, 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 ah. He was very surprised to hear what happened. So what exactly happened? So just let's, a very interesting civics lesson for a moment, right? We know that how a bill becomes to law, it has to pass through both houses of Congress. But basically, if you want to get if you want to get a bill to become a law, you have to get it onto the Senate floor. It has to usually go through a committee, and then you have to ask the majority leader to put it to a vote. And let's say you have a bill that you like, let's say this bill, that you want to get it to a vote, the Senate majority leader will tell you no, because Senate floor time is in very high demand. And they're not interested in ancillary laws because there's more important matters to discuss. So you can ask for unanimous consent. Right? Unanimous consent, you can pretty much do anything. Any senator can go to the floor anytime and ask for unanimous consent to skip all the debate and just pass the bill immediately. If no one objects, it's done. But if a single senator objects, then the bill is blocked. Right? Some of us might be familiar if we are involved in pro-Israel advocacy in the aftermath of the hostilities in Israel in May. There was overwhelming bipartisan support for the United States appropriating an additional $1 billion to Israel to replenish their Iron Dome missile supply. And something that President Biden asked for, it's something that everyone was, overwhelming majority of Congress was supporting. I think it was passed 420 to 9 in the House of Representatives, and the effort was to approve this by unanimous consent in the Senate. But one senator blocked it. His name is Rand Paul from Kentucky. He had an objection, not necessarily because he doesn't support Israel, but in this case, he was adamant that the $1 billion for Israel be reallocated from funds that had been committed to Afghanistan that weren't being spent because of the Taliban takeover. So he had his own pet peeve with the issue, and he objected. And even though there were no other objections, this additional $1 billion for Israel was hung up because of the objection of Rand Paul. The postscript is that when they just passed this omnibus funding through the rest of the fiscal year, that $1 billion was included. Israel will get those funds. But unanimous consent, any senator can block it. Now, what happens? How does it happen? You just call for it on the floor of the Senate? You can't do that. You have to give some sort of notice. So the way it's usually done in the Senate today is that a senator will what they call hotline their bill. They will, what does it mean to hotline the bill? A hotline means that every single senator's office will be notified that this is happening. And then the senators can decide to place a hold on that bill so that it doesn't go through. You don't have to take it to the floor and then have somebody object and do it that way. It's the way of doing business. So not everyone has to show up all the time onto the floor of the Senate. So, if you hotline the bill and then you want to put a hold on the bill, then if there's no holds on the bill, it can go to the Senate floor. And if there is going to be, maybe you will try and you want to speak out against it, then it will get schedule some floor time on the Senate. So what happened in this case is that the bill was hotlined, and there had been a request for unanimous consent. And the word on the street was that there was a senator who was going to object. His name was Roger Wicker. But they moved the consent request to a day. Roger Wicker was flying out on a Wednesday, so they moved the consent request to Tuesday so he could block it, because he said he was going to block it, but he never blocked it. And then he never blocked it. No one else had decided to block it. So basically this bill was hotline. There was an effort to try and stop it. They had to reschedule that. It wasn't blocked, and it kind of basically just slipped into being passed by the Senate by unanimous consent. Now, if this makes you worried about what else can slip through the cracks in our government, be concerned. But what happened here was that basically the various offices of the senators dropped the ball. Probably everyone else thought that Roger Wicker was going to stop this. And even people who were opposed to this bill never spoke up. And now we have a permanent daylight savings time bill that has cleared the Senate, making its way to the House, and stay tuned to see what happens. Now, it's probably not the most important piece of legislation that's out there, and it may take a very long time for this to even be discussed again by the House. And of course, if you know your civics, if the House changes anything, there has to be a conference committee. So, even if you're opposed, like OU and Aguda are in this situation, I wouldn't be, all that worried just yet about how this plays out. Of course, we still have at least another year anyway. So that is with regards to this bill. There's, so if Abba Cohen was blindsided and had no idea it was coming, neither did most of the senators, so many of whom actually opposed this bill, but now it has cleared the Senate. So with that civics lesson in hand, any questions on the presentation of the bill before we start identifying some of the halachic complexity, complications, and solutions.
Rabbi, what is your personal opinion? Bottom line, yes or no?
Well, bottom line is I really hate Fridays when Shabbos starts at 4 o'clock. I have to be honest. I am in a position that essentially my day begins when the morning services begin. So that's gonna, if those have to be later, then my day has to start later. So I have not, since as I just mentioned, this this bill got fast tracked. I didn't really have a chance to fully think through whether it's better for eliminating childhood obesity or the environment and the like. If you're talking about early Fridays being eliminated, that sounds pretty good to me. But I think that it's so on that side, let's go for it. I haven't fully thought it through yet. It's just that those early Fridays are killers. Short Fridays, I should say. Although for some, as we've just started daylight savings time, I think it's a rule of Jewish time that no matter how long you have on Friday, it always feels short. It just, you're always doing something to the last minute.
Some people like it Shabbos to end early on Saturday evening. They can make a date and go out.
Right. So remember,
I think you're going to get a lot of resistance from your Northwestern states and Congress people because,
So look, I think it seems that it seems like the bill will pass. It seems like there has a majority. Just in terms of in general, who likes it works well for farmers, right? It has supported some important educational constituents in their unions. Considering considering the direction in energy prices, it probably it won't necessarily impact the bottom line of the energy companies all that much, but we'll see. There's kind of a broader issue in terms of how Jewish law developed with regards to time that we'll take up towards the end. But I think that the biggest concern is, as Rabbi J. David Bleich writes in source number 4, and he was addressing this back in the 70s when this issue first emerged. Of course, the problems which arise with regard to determining the earliest permissible time for morning prayers may be obviated by advising individuals who must leave their homes at an early hour to pray at downtown synagogues, to organize minyanim near their places of work, or to pray without the benefit of a minyan. Right? Rabbi Black says everything is solvable. Maybe you daven closer to your office. Right? This could be a very big boon for the office minyan industry. Right? People are used to a certain routine. You wake up in the morning, you go to shul and daven, and then you go to work. Well, maybe you have to wake up in the morning, go to work, and then daven. So he says, every issue, has a solution. If you can't daven because of the timing, daven later. But he says, however, many rabbis are quite correctly concerned lest the adoption of such a policy have a negative effect upon the spiritual welfare of the community at large. At stake is not only the survival of the daily minyan in suburban areas, but also participation in prayer by countless numbers of Jews. The idea of people who are, people whose connection to minyan attendance or worship not on a Shabbat or a holiday, with regards to Kaddish, with regards to yard sites, with regards to, even with regards to some of the, the occasional participation, whether it be in the high holiday season. Some people sometimes come for a Slichot service or Chol HaMoed Sukkot Hoshana Rabbah service or Purim. A lot of these things are going to be very much shifted with a change of maintaining daylight savings time permanently. And so Rabbi Bleich gets the ball rolling by pointing out, look, there's a solution, but that solution may come with a certain disruption to the various community norms that have been good for the community. Remember, a lot of this is relating to, more, especially it relates to morning prayers, because if things are later in the day, people can do those on their own. But if it's about starting the day with davening, now the day doesn't allow you to start the day with davening so much. It kind of turns a lot of things on its head, in addition to the communal institutional disruptions. Look, I think even as an example, this year Purim fell after the adoption of daylight savings time. So Megillah reading was late. It was 7:30, and there was a lot of conversation. Purim night is often a great time for kids to come out, and it's a wonderful celebration. But wait a second, 7:30. Megillah, you're not going to be done until 8:30, 9 o'clock, and people are going to bring their children out. Now, some people, when it comes to these types of things, bedtimes go by the wayside, right? Friday nights in the summer when Shabbos is late. So some people will adopt an early Shabbos so that things are done and kids can go to sleep. Other people will say, no, we'll start Shabbos at 8, you're eating dinner at 9, and then you go to sleep at 11, 12 o'clock. That's just, the rhythm of Jewish life. But with regards to Purim, it's kind of, wouldn't it have been nicer had we been able to start the Megillah earlier? So just, it happened to be in our experience here that it seemed that, people were gung-ho for bringing their kids out. So it didn't matter how late it was. So sometimes you can just plow right through it. And if something is significant enough or compelling enough, it doesn't matter. But, it could impact negatively for those who are not necessarily as committed to participating. Wait a second, that's very late. I don't want to be out so late. Or that's way too early. I don't want to be there so early. Look, in many, just two other examples. One, the Pesach Seder coming up, right? The Pesach Seder can't start till 8 or something like that. That's kind of late, especially that considering that the Seder is usually not the shortest meal that we have. And so very often the question is, well, how early could it start? And we'll talk a little bit more about that after going over the prayer sources. Or, with regards to, there was a time, especially in the 1950s, that many Orthodox synagogues in the wintertime would have the late Friday night service. They would always start 6:30 on Friday night because there was a recognition that, look, Shabbos may start at 4 o'clock, but they just didn't have the constituency to show up at 4 o'clock. So let's not do that. Let's just, have a service at 6:30. We're not asking what people were doing. We can't daven the afternoon mincha service, but you can daven Kabbalat Shabbat, the Friday night Shabbos service late. So let's just make it. Let's create it in a way that that will work. And to this day, even different outreach programs. When I was running the beginners program at KJ, we do a Friday night dinner. Shabbos started at 4 o'clock, and we would start at 6:30. And that was like, what are you doing for 2 hours while you're waiting for the evening service to start? It was somewhat disruptive for the family and those just waiting around. I remember that it used to be that they always had a rule. It would always be 7 o'clock Friday night year round. Okay, in the summer, that means it's an hour before Shabbos starts. In the winter, it's 3 hours after Shabbos starts. So at some point, we even moved it in the winter. We started at 5:45. That already is an hour and 45 minutes, but it was the idea of recognizing the constituents and making an accommodation. So what exactly are the rules of morning prayers that this really impacts? How complicated will it be? So the article before mentioned the idea of starting morning prayers at sunrise, but the Shulchan Aruch points out that there's an earlier time that can be utilized as needed, and that time is called Alot HaShachar, which is the first light. Literally means the rise of the morning star. And it's the time, and it is an astronomical time that is known as first light. So the Shulchan Aruch and the laws of Shema, whoever is unavoidably prevented from saying the Shema at the more appropriate time of sunrise can recite Shema with its blessings from daybreak. That's the Alot HaShachar, because it's still fitting that we call it the time when you rise up, right? It's still fitting to call it the time of creation of light, right? The first bracha for Shema is that God creates light. Well, guess what? Even though it's still removed from sunrise, there's still a lightening of the sky. And what do we say in the Shema? We say the Shema when you get up and when you go to sleep. Well, guess what? If I'm awake at this hour, I should be able to say the Shema. And then the Shulchan Aruch says if one recited it from the daybreak, but before the proper time, even though one wasn't unavoidably prevented from reciting Shema at the appropriate time, one fulfilled his obligation after the fact. Basically saying that even though ideally you should wait till it's closer to actual morning with sunrise, and you should only say it earlier if you really have to, even if you don't really have to, you can say the Shema at this earlier hour. So there seems to be an accommodation. I think the key words are the fact that the liturgy itself, the morning prayers, the blessings for Shema, recognize God as creating light. That applies the morning time. That it's not about sunrise. If you're waking up in the morning, that's considered morning time. We say the Shema when you get up. Now, if someone can't sleep and wakes up at 2 a.m, we don't call that when you wake up. But essentially, the liturgy and the idea of morning ritual obligations is in the morning, and that's when you're getting up, and it's not completely connected to how much light can be seen. There is a limit, right? There's a time that we're talking about here, this idea of daybreak, and we'll talk a little bit about specifics of when that is in a moment, but it's not, we may prefer that it be morning, that it be sunrise, but that's an additional layer of obligation and precision. The theme of the morning prayers is when you wake up. And some people wake up at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. That's not considered when people wake up. But when people are waking up, even that's before there's light outside, as long as it's past a certain threshold, we will accommodate it. And it doesn't even have to necessarily be for a compelling reason. We still can accept the fact that you're davening and saying the Shema earlier. This was the Shema. The Shulchan Aruch Code of Jewish Law says the same thing is true for the Shemona Esrei. In an extenuating circumstance, for example, if one needs to get up early for a journey, source 6, you may pray the Amida at dawn. That's the daybreak period, and wait to recite Shema till the proper time has arrived. Even though by doing so, one is not adopting the blessing of redemption immediately precedes the Amida to the Amida, we are still saying that in its proper time is more important. Right? Usually when we daven in the morning, we say the Shema, immediately followed by the Amidah Shemona Esrei, and we like linking the two directly to one another. The Shulchan Aruch is saying you don't have to do it that way if the timing doesn't work out. But essentially, we are seeing that the Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law, accepted practice is to recognize that we're not a sunrise being the beginning of the day, even though we calculate a lot of our times from sunrise onwards. Right? When we talk about how calculating the times of the day for the ideal times for Shema and prayer and earliest times for Mincha, we do usually use sunrise as the beginning of the day. There's a recognition of the fact that the beginning of the day is when you wake up. And as long as it's heading in that direction of daylight, we will consider that sufficient. And interestingly, the Biur Halacha, the commentary of Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan, the Mishnah Berurah Chafetz Chaim has another commentary, Biur Halacha, quotes that there's even an opinion that, guess what? The Shulchan Aruch was presenting this as less than ideal, but there's an opinion of the Pri Chadash that once you start hitting dawn, daybreak, once you start the period of waking up, you can daven that early. So some would say the optimal time is sunrise, and only in extenuating circumstances can you daven early. Well, guess what? There's a view that says daven early, no matter what. You wake up early. It's as long as you've crossed that little bit that threshold. As we're heading towards sunrise in the morning, then it is okay. And Rabbi Bleich points out that what is this time period? How long before sunrise? So he says, according to calculations made a number of years ago by a group of graduate students at Beth Medrash Elyon, in which the writer, he had participated, Alos HaShachar in New York City fluctuates between 80 and 111 minutes prior to sunrise. All right, so if you're talking about a day like today, so today sunrise was at 6:53. So 6:53, usually Alot HaShachar is understood, everyone accepts Alot HaShachar as being about 72 minutes earlier than that. So 6:53, 72 minutes earlier is, how's your math? 5:42. So you can daven at 5:42. Here they're saying you can even go sometimes, depending on the season, even earlier. So usually that works out for people. Now, this is considered quote unquote a later sunrise. But we can end up with sunrise being much earlier at times. But we're seeing that Jewish law always recognizes the possibility of davening earlier than sunrise. And so some would say this is only in extenuating circumstances, and others would say daven early all the time. But we have that opportunity. The tricky thing would be that when it was analyzed back in the 70s as to what this would mean for, when is sunrise the latest? What season of the year? Winter, right? The sunrise is usually latest in the wintertime. January can be really, when we wake up in the morning and you're like, it's dark outside. It's like 7:15, so it can get, but so that would be most problematic, right? If it was January and sunrise is usually 7:15 for us, well, guess if it's daylight savings time, sunrise would probably be more closer to 8:15. So when the numbers were crunched for what might be the earliest acceptable time to daven in New York in January time, based on these numbers of being an hour and 15 minutes or so before sunrise, what would be the earliest time to daven? It was around 7:15, which for those of us who go to 7:30 morning minyan have no problem with, because we're already in the permissible time, whether it's an extenuating circumstance or whether, as the Pri Chadash says, you can do that time any time. But remember, New York's latest sunrise is an hour earlier than some places in the Midwest, which would mean that the earliest prayer time that could take place for them would be 8:15. Now, some people like that, but some people have to get to work. So how it plays out could be somewhat problematic. Now, I think that it's important to point out that we looked at the halachic conclusions of, when is the optimal time sunrise, when is the permissible time first light. When this was presented initially by the Talmud, the Talmud talked about davening early. Source number 9, Brachot 38, when Shmuel's father and Levi wanted to set out on a journey in the morning, they would pray early before sunrise. When during their journey, the time to recite Shema would arrive, they recited it. So here we have a situation of rabbis who had to leave early, and they were not able to daven yet, but they would daven, even though it was too early. Rashi says, how early? Early. He doesn't actually define the timeline of it. So there seems to be, again, this recognition that when you wake up, that's the time frame for morning services. Now, there's an optimal time, which is when the sun rises. There's a period before that, from the time you wake up to sunrise, that may be more acceptable or less acceptable to daven, depending on the circumstances. But there is this idea of, in the Talmud, of when do you daven in the morning? When you wake up. However, the layers of further halachic discussion seem to narrow that window to some extent. As Rabbi Blech points out in source number 11, none of the authorities cited sanctions recitation of Shachar's prayers earlier than Alot HaShachar under the conditions prevailing in our country. Indeed, every effort should be made not to recite the Shemona Esrei until Heyir Pnei Mizrach, until it starts getting a little bit light. Right? It seems that in the Talmud, they woke up early and they started davening. How early? Whenever they woke up. And then it seems that we want it to only be from that time of daybreak. And then we seem to prefer it being a little bit post daybreak. And then we want it to even be sunrise. It seems that the windows seem to narrow as the halachic conversation continued, probably because that was usually when it was feasible. There was no real overly complicated situation, right? If you've ever been, in Israel, right, you never end up with the first light being so early that you can't daven yet, right? It's like certain parts of the country that sunrise and sunset, it's never so early and never so late, right? Certain parts of the country have times that work out a little bit different, right? Like, for example, in Florida, they don't have 4:00 Fridays like we do in the Northeast. So it seems that the halachic discussion developed within the context where the window for prayers was always fairly flexible, right? You could always daven in the morning when you woke up because it fit the window, and it never became all that problematic anytime during the year. However, as extenuating circumstances arose, things did become it became necessary sometimes to go back to these sources like the source number 9 in Brachot, where you got to daven early. How early? Early. Right? Rashi doesn't quantify it because you just got to do what you have to do. And Rabbi Black references it. It's part of his article on the subject, that some of these questions arose in communist Russia, in the Soviet Union, when there was a requirement for people to go out to their work at certain times, no matter what. And those who wanted to go above and beyond and still daven before going to work, what should they do? Right? We're talking about people who had no choice. They had to be at roll call at a certain time, and they had no choices of delaying that or the like. I would say that certainly in the aftermath of these past couple of years, where there's more flexibility in the workplace, if you want to get people to come in, you're trying to be more flexible, this might be a good time to lobby for the start times you need to be able to still daven and get to work. But that's why Rabbi Black says, under the conditions prevailing in our country, right? In America, no one's forcing us or oppressing us the way they did back in in the Soviet era, or other eras of persecution. But the idea of the idea of necessity allowing for a certain amount of flexibility, and I think that on the one hand, the flexibility exists within the halachic system. Talmud Brachot opens it up. Rashi allows it. How early? Early. But since the necessity wasn't always there, and the community was able to function and even thrive within the parameters that Jewish law was setting, there was never a pushback. And I think that certain places or certain times may have led to a reevaluation. I want to talk about Jews living in places that don't have regular sunrise and sunset, and a little bit of a postscript on the Seder. Yes, Rosie.
Nothing. Just, is this the J. David Blech from 78th Street Shul? That man?
Yeah. It's Rabbi Black from
okay.
Yorkville Shul from Yeshiva University.
Right.
He has, I think, already now 7 or 8 volumes of these works on contemporary halachic problems. Probably one of the most eloquent expositors of Jewish law in English. But it happened to be that. So back in the 70s, he wrote this article. I would imagine it might get some reevaluation today. One of he references a calculation of the times for the New York area that was done back then by Rabbi Mordechai Willig from Yeshiva University. And Rabbi Willig actually, when this conversation emerged over the last week, went back to his times to evaluate and what that would mean for the New York area. Again, we're still far from this becoming actual practice, but it certainly is something that's that from a halachic perspective is being addressed once again. With regards to the timing, we see them. We see the need for creative application of these times when it comes to areas where you don't have traditional sunrise sunset area, Jews living in places closer to the Arctic Circle. What happens when you don't have sunrise and sunset, right? Some of these non-traditional locations that push the limits of application of Jewish law. You could say the date line is something similar, right? How does the date line play out, and which date line gets utilized? These have been areas that have led to an attempt to try and align the times with others. Some of the places where you don't have a sunrise or sunset, in certain times of the year, like in the Arctic areas, or as you approach the Arctic Circle, there was even an opinion that you follow the time from the place where you're coming from. So imagine a point in the Arctic Circle for one person who's coming from New York and the other person's coming from Jerusalem, and they spend it in the same place in the Arctic Circle for a Shabbos. They're keeping different times. Because one keeps Jerusalem time and one keeps New York time. Now that's a very unique position of Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, the Tiferes Yisrael, but it highlights how that how there seem to be some very unorthodox situations where we can find ourselves having to apply the rules of Jewish time, whether it be the timing of davening or the timing of Shabbos or the like. Or the example, of the dateline. Which dateline do we follow? The sources, the Talmudic sources for dateline don't describe, the everyday travel across a dateline and how to utilize it. And you have different opinions. And I would say that most commonly people would apply the easiest, follow the dateline. Where the world says the dateline is, you follow it. So if you're wherever you are, that's what you do. But there's some sources based on the Talmud that require utilizing it differently, which can mean that being in a certain place could require keeping Shabbos differently, right? According to one opinion, Japan is on the other side of the date line, and therefore the Japanese Sunday would be Jewishly Shabbos. And so if you follow that opinion, you have a very complex situation. Or a famous opinion of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, if you cross the date line during the Omer, you still have to follow from where you come from. So I believe the application of this would be if you flew from Australia to New York during the Omer, you would keep Shavuos on a different day. It would be a day later. So this is, this is the role that time plays. It also highlights that when the laws of time, as they developed, they were really developing for where Jews were living and not necessarily envisioning where Jews might live or find themselves. A very basic example is that the time where we request rain in our Shemona Esrei, in our prayers in the wintertime. Well, that's now, but that's summer in the Southern Hemisphere. And so there was really no consideration for Jews living in places where the standard rules wouldn't be able to apply. And as the laws developed, it was addressing this more narrow, this more, the more standard group where Jews would be. And just, as a postscript with regards to the Seder time, right? Usually we don't have a problem with starting the next day early, right? In the summertime, Shabbos, candlelighting might be 8 o'clock, but we'll start Shabbos at 7 o'clock. We have no problem with that. We have difficulty ending Shabbos early. We'll never end Shabbos based on an earlier time, but why not start it early? And if so, why not start the Seder early? And really is very deeply entrenched in waiting until nightfall for the Seder. Now, certain parts of the Seder might be able to start early, and no one says the Seder has to be 3 hours long, and there are other ways to make the Seder move along once you start it after dark. But the Talmud introduces the idea of not eating on Pesach night, not eating until it gets dark, is the statement in the Talmud. And from here, the interpretations have led to things like not making Kiddush until it gets dark, or not doing, or not, or not even starting the Seder till it gets dark. The halachic analysis took that statement and put it in a lane, and we go forward with it to an extent that it's very well entrenched in Jewish law or Jewish practice, not starting the Seder till it gets dark. At the same time, if you want to take a step back, just like the Talmud in Brachot says, daven early, you could also start a Seder early. Just on the surface of the question, can you start the day early? The answer is yes. But it's another example that as the law developed, when it came to prayer, certain times were deemed as the acceptable times, and certain times were viewed only as under extenuating circumstances. And now we have, when confronted with permanent daylight savings time, we have to go back to the drawing board and recalculate. Even though the Talmud says when you wake up, that's when you stop in the morning. The halachic process unfolded somewhat differently. Same thing with regards to being in a place where Jews generally did not find themselves that would move them outside of the way times were calculated. Right? We have our times, but when you're in a place where that doesn't apply, we have to then scramble to find an alternate explanation. And I think with regards to the Seder starting after dark, of course, usually you would start early, but the halachic process developed and took a theme with regard to the Seder and put it in a different direction, built momentum in that direction, which is why that's the common acceptable practice from which we do not deviate. So is daylight savings time, permanent daylight savings time, good for the Jews? I think it's somewhat neutral. It will lead to a certain complexity. Not sure the House of Representatives will act as quickly as the Senate, because that's not how Congress works these days. But it does open up a conversation as to times, whether they be for prayer or for some of our other rituals, and how times sometimes develop differently, or the application develops differently as Jews find themselves in different types of situations that maybe we had not before.